Okay, so what you can see here is the amassing of a large convoy getting ready to head out. These are mainly merchant ships, and so what would happen is the escorting destroyers would be on usually in the front and behind, and then would try and respond to attacks by German submarines. And so the Battle of the Atlantic is really just the battle over shipping. The Royal Canadian Navy before World War I had 3 vessels. Or before World War had 13 vessels and 3,000 men. By the end of the war, they are the 5th largest navy in the world. And so this is a big part of that industry, and the industry with the war that I was talking about. And also that allowed them to be much more efficient. The RC after the war had 373 fighting ships and over 90,000 men. So you can see the huge growth in the Navy, and that was in response to the convoys. What does this say about Canada's role in the war? Well, one of its major roles in the war, besides the industry, because they built most of these ships, was to make sure that the stuff that was built by the United States and built by Canada gets from the Western Hemisphere to Great Britain. Canada basically and Britain controlled or ran the North Atlantic trade routes, whereas the United States ran more of the southern trade routes. And so they kind of escorted those kind of together. Canada played a major role in this, especially between 1939 and 1941, with the United States just kind of getting on, coming up to speed in 1941. 1943, U.S. Navy escorted South Atlantic routes, and the Canadian Navy escorted North Atlantic routes. So let's talk a little bit about the efficiency of the U-boats. So first convoy left in September of 1939, left Halifax and reached Great Britain safely. But between October 17th and 19th, in 1947, U-boats attacked a convoy heading that had 34 ships, and they sank 22 of them. Admiral Karl Donitz came up with this wolf pack tactic, which was to mass submarines into large groups and then to attack these convoys. So instead of one submarine trying to attack a convoy, they would attack it with large groups. And so usually they would use a delaying or a tactic where one submarine would hit and pull back, and then the other submarines would attack the far side. And so they were very effective, to the point where over 500 tons of shipping were lost to U-boats in 1941. And you can see that as it continued, the submarines were very effective. Now, you notice that in 1939, Canada expanded its coastal air bases to use planes to protect convoys. Once planes were able to protect the entire convoy route, you see that the Battle of Atlantic becomes pretty much over. And also there was, but up until that point, you could see that the German U-boats were basically threatening to bring the entire Allied shipping campaign to a halt. During the first 20 days of March 1943, 85 Allied ships were torpedoed and sunk. These were the darkest hours of the Battle of Atlantic. So how did they defeat these U-boats? Well, they improved radar and radio direction finding systems, often called ASDIC, and they were installed onto Allied vessels, allowing them to better locate and hunt down German submarines. The creation of support groups that could hunt submarines while the ships of the convoy stayed put. So you would have, what you would have is, you'd have a group of ships that were outlining the convoy, and then you would have a group that would hunt the submarines so that the ships around the convoy wouldn't move. They would protect those aspects, and then the group that was following would then break out and attack the different submarines as they hit. That became a very effective strategy. In 1943, the British Navy trained Canadian escort groups to do this very thing, and they became much more effective. Air patrols kept expanding in the range until they could cover the whole route, because most of them were being sunk where they were no longer covered by airplanes, because airplane to submarines were good. Canada also helped develop a new weapon called the Hedgehog. So they used the sonar given by the British, used radar and radio direction to track German submarines, and then invented the Hedgehog. And this would be attached to the corvettes and the destroyers in the front of these small ships. They ordered large amounts of small ships early on in the war, and as those ships became online, they became much more effective. So the Hedgehog would launch up to 24 mortars into the water and just blanket a whole area. And the way this works is it creates a concussion area around the submarine. It puts pressure on the water. And so submarines, when the added pressure or the water gets disturbed, oftentimes can be that the pressure ratings within the submarine can create leaks and possibly break up the submarine. And so this was a tactic that became very effective. In 1943, the British trained Canadian escort groups, like I was saying before. The Royal Canadian Navy upgraded most of its escort ships with new technology. And so these changes altered the war. In June and August, the Allies sunk over 80 U-boats, and that basically ended what we consider the war, the Atlantic. And so in 1944, basically, all the ships were getting across, and the U-boats, because they weren't updated as much, and because Hitler and the Germans didn't put a lot of stock or put a lot of new technology in there, they kind of no longer were effective. So now let's talk about the military involvement of Canada. Let's first look at the raid at Dieppe. Dieppe was part of the French coast, was considered Fortress Europe. And this idea of Dieppe was that what they were trying to do was to see how strong the fortress was. And they were going to try and create a breach into France. And if this worked, then the Allies would follow up on this. This was partly a operation in which was just to test the defenses and to see how strong this was, and to learn information about if they ever did want to try and attack the coast, which they later did in D-Day. So the failure of the raid, where half the troops did not return, 907 Canadians died, another 500 injured, and 1,054 captured. The raid was a total disaster. They lost equipment. More Allied planes were shot down, 119 than any other day in the European theater. And so it was a complete and utter disaster. But there were two positive outcomes to come out of this. Number one, well, first of all, let's talk about the poor leadership. They did not. So the raid was going on, and because of the way the British command worked, basically once the command was given, there wasn't not anybody on site that was kind of allowed to then pull off. And so they had to radio back, and finally they were able to pull out. The British High Command, actually, and the admiral in charge here pushed the raid forward when it was very clear that they had no chance. They were on the beach, and they were basically being gunned down. The position, the place they took, they couldn't break through. It was impenetrable, and they took the amount of casualties that I was telling you before. And so the poor leadership was that they should have pulled back. They should have retreated, and they didn't. But there are two things that you can say positive outcomes. One that shows what it would take to defeat Germany at Normandy, and it convinced the USSR that of the Allies' commitment to war. It convinced them that they are planning on doing an attack, and eventually they would carry through. These lessons were valuable. These things were valuable, but probably not worth the cost in which it took. So that brings us to the Canadians launched a hard-fought campaign in Sicily and Italy. Sicily is the island outside of Italy, and so basically one of the ways after the African campaign, the Americans and the British and the Canadians continued up to try and go through Italy and enter Europe. The problem was that once Italy surrendered, the Germans basically fortified northern Italy with the mountains, and it was almost impossible to get them out. Most of the fighting was extremely tough go to move from one town to the other. The Battle of Ortona, Italy, was door to door and basically house to house to eliminate the Germans. It was very costly to the Canadian Army. There was a lot of casualties with questionable results, given that there was the town didn't have a lot of value. So then we move into the military role D-Day. Canadian soldiers landed on the stretch, sand code name Juno Beach. When I sent you a link in your email so you could look it up now or you could look it up tomorrow, and it just shows the 5 different beaches and who was kind of in charge of each beach at Normandy. The Juno Beach was this one. By nightfall of June 6th, the Canadian troops had advanced farther inland than any other Allied force. Half of our original company, those I had joined up with in June 1940, had been killed or wounded. The tears came. I went behind a wall. So many had been taken. Charles Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles, which was a Canadian unit. And one of the issues here, you can see the casualties here, is that Canada, despite being in Great Britain for several years, never really fully trained the troops to do this amphibious assault. And so the Canadians wound up, despite having a beach with less coverage, where they had less to go from, the Americans took a couple beaches where they had longer to run from the sea line to cover, where the Canadians had a very short, but because their troops were not very well trained, they took more casualties than they probably needed to. D-Day launched the Battle of Normandy, which then basically led to the Allies working their way to Germany. There was the Battle of the Bulge later on, where Germany kind of did a counterattack towards the Allies. Canada was involved in that as well. But basically, Canada was involved in mainly European battles. As you can see, they fought in Hong Kong. Was their only kind of foray into the Pacific theater, so they mainly fought in the European theater. And you can see here that although they did not have great training, although they did not perform the same way they did in World War I as the shock troops, they were still valuable, and they were enough in number that they were able to make some definite inways and help out the Allies. The total population in 1942 of Canada was 11 million. 1.1 million men, all volunteers. Men in the military, the Army enlisted 730,000, not all volunteers. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Air Force is 260,000, and the Navy 115,000 personnel. And so this was the manpower contribution of Canada. You can see that this was greater than a great percentage of their people were involved in this war, a great percentage of their men, which was greater than the percentage of the United States, even though the United States wound up at one point of 16 million men serving at one point. King in the conscription crisis of World War I. Mackenzie King was a consummate politician. He tried to avoid all conflicts at all times. He always wanted to keep the balance of power. He was always trying to get everyone on board to build consensus before he did anything. Part of that was just being a crafty politician, and part of that was because his main objective was to get reelected. It was very rarely to stand on principle. The National Resource Mobilization Act was passed in 1940 to create a conscripted force, but for home defense only. He promised no conscription, later kind of said, I promise not to send conscripts over to Europe. The French-Canadian view was that they felt like even the conscripted force for home defense. They did not want to be forced to fight for Great Britain or France because they had little connection to either, and they did not want to be a part of that conflict. So basically, after King wanted the flexibility to be able to call troops up after the Dieppe raid, especially after and then after D-Day, he realized he needed troops. So he kind of sets this up in 1942 with a national plebiscite, which is a direct vote in which the entire electorate is invited to accept or refuse a proposal. This is basically what happens in the election of 1917 for the National Service Act, which is conscription earlier. Quebec voted 72.9% against conscription. So you can see that Quebec in both wars wants nothing to do with it. However, the overall Canadian vote was 60% in favor. It passed with 60% of the vote. And only 17% of Ontario actually voted against it. So you can see that really this was Canada, again, Quebec standing alone. Quandaries for King. So he basically is in a spot where he either chooses to unite Canada around conscription, or divide Canada around conscription, or to, although go forward with conscription, try to maintain Canada, French Canada, by not sending anybody abroad. The National Resources Mobilization Act was amended. Not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary. By 1944, the shortage of Canadian troops in Europe, King decided it was necessary. He sent 16,000 men. This was from the National Resources Mobilization Act men overseas. Only 2,463 of these soldiers went to the front line, and only 69 were killed. The fallout in Quebec was the best of a bad lot. They felt like this was something that they were not in support of, but it was really very little that could have been done. King had avoided a major division and the bloody riots that had accompanied the conscription crisis during World War I, but did not avoid the kind of division that it creates in Canada. One last thing to talk about is just Canada and the USA, national security. Roosevelt and King. King called for FDR, suggested a meeting at Augsburg, New York, where they created a permanent joint board on defense. This was in 1940, before the war. Again, the United States making alliances, and this joint defense kind of lined out who would control what, and later led to them dividing up the Battle of Atlantic, dividing up and working together with the convoys. And so there was close cooperation between Canada and the United States as they worked together to help with the war effort. So this is pretty much longer than I was hoping, but hopefully it won't be too long. Bring this tomorrow, and then we will discuss the notes.